Hi, I'm Andy Schmuckler. I'm back from the previous video that I gather had some problems at the end technically. I had said that I was going to show the reality, actually an important reality, at the center of the human drama, that we can see that there's at work a force, a coherent force that consistently spreads a pattern of brokenness or consistently makes the human world worse. I said that there were four ways of showing it, or maybe there are only three and a half, because the one I'm going to start with is a little sketchy in my mind, but I think it works. And that was the one that I made some use of in the previous video, where I talked about that the Republican Party has become this extraordinary thing because an alliance got formed under a single party's tent between two very powerful forces of brokenness. I said, what were the biggest contributors to the things that were not good about America in the period from the end of the Civil War to the signing of the civil rights legislation? And the answer was there was one of America's two major parties was what was used by the Democratic. The Democratic Party was used by the force of what had been the slave power and became white supremacy and Jim Crow and white racism, however you want to talk about it. And that the other major party was the home of the other major force of brokenness, which was the corporate greed that the robber barons and the emerging industrial corporate system basically had the Republican Party as its instrument for all that almost a century. And then because LBJ signed civil rights legislations in the middle 60s, that political force migrated to the Republican Party out of the Democratic Party. That Strom Thurmond and Trent Lott and all these Dixiecrats, these Jim Crow types, and their constituencies all moved to the Republican Party. It took, I don't know, they talked about Nixon's Southern strategies in 68, but the whole migration probably took 20, 25 years. By the mid-90s, the Republican Party was housed both of those major forces of brokenness. And as I see it, the alliance made by these two forces of brokenness, and you can see they have played different functions as this fascistic force has been taking over the Republican Party. The white supremacy thing delivers the ballots and the electoral votes of the once solid South, whereas the corporate thing runs the show basically and takes power and wealth away from the average Americans and gives it to those who already have the most power and wealth. Those are the two big forces of brokenness that America had to struggle with from 1865 to 1965, but they largely canceled each other out so long as they were housed in different parties. But once they both became part of the Republican Party, you had a force of brokenness that they blended into each other and became much more powerful enough that by the mid-1990s, the Republican Party was becoming was being taken over. You can see that something darker is taking over when it's Limbaugh and Gingrich and then Fox News and Karl Rove and onward to Trump. When I first saw that this coherent force that consistently makes things worse, when I saw that force, I was struck that the way it behaved was very much the way the force of evil. If you go back and into out of the secular worldview that I operate in, and that I think of my audience is operating in, I am here to offer an idea about the reality of evil, the importance of seeing that reality, and to do so in a purely secular worldview kind of a way. I was trained as a social scientist or social theoretician, or I don't know what I was trained in. That's another topic. But the country gave me all the best opportunities in that respect, and I believe that I can offer to show the dynamics in terms of evidence and logic, secular worldview, that shows the reality of a force of evil, a force that's reasonable to be called evil. I know that liberals don't like that word. I've been fighting that fight for 20 years now, maybe more. No, I think 20 years will do it. But that force is suggested, I think, when you see the alacrity with which different forms of or currents of that force can flow together. When I first saw it in 2024, and then after the election of 2024, when I embarked full time on fighting what I saw rising and taking over conservative America, the Republican Party. I shouldn't say conservative America. Well, maybe so, but in any event, I didn't think of it. I thought of it as more focused, and it was at that point focused. It was starting with the, well, it wasn't just starting then, really, but there was an escalation when with the W presidency. And you could see it percolating down the system into the Republicans in Congress, and then into some of the state houses, and then you could see it seeping into the Republican base, which I had actually been having meaningful conversations with on the radio for a decade, but it was coming from the top down. Because the Republican Party had changed into something which could be taken, which was powerful enough to take over the whole Republican Party, a conservative America that had been a mixture of the good, the constructive and the destructive, of virtues and profound character defects, increasingly became, because of the alliance of those two big forces, it became the home only of a force of brokenness. And it got to the point where everything it did made the world more broken. Everything it said made the world more broken. It was a kind of consistency that I don't think you can find in any major American political party, with the possible exception of the Democratic Party of the 1850s. I haven't looked at it with that question in mind, but this is an extraordinary party, and it's extraordinary because it's not a mixture of the constructive and destructive. It is wholly owned by something destructive. And the fact that wherever you look, it's doing something destructive, you can infer that there's something coherent behind it. That the force of corporate greed and the force of white supremacy are two different forms of the same thing. Now, when I first saw this evil, I focused a lot on trying to understand it. And I came to a kind of understanding that was sufficient that I put out the word to the platforms on which I had previously put out big ideas. A variety of Unitarian churches from the East Coast and the Southwest and the West Coast, talking about the concept of evil, why it is intellectually valid, which is what I claim I can show, and politically and spiritually important. What I said in that talk to Unitarians and to the Ethical Society was that there had been a confluence in America of three different rivers of brokenness. Not exactly the same ones that the two that I had talked about with respect to the Republican Party, though at this point I wasn't thinking about how the implications of the racism and the greed coming under the same tent, no longer canceling each other out. And to that I added, because at this time, one of the major concerns was the invasion of Iraq, which was undertaken for, I thought, really wrong reasons, and which was, moreover, botched. And I saw it as an expression of American imperialism. And in this thing, besides those other two, American imperialism is a very profound part of the history of the rise of this civilization, starting with taking land in the East from tribes that had lived here, without the brokenness of imperialism is captured by what the Athenians said about how the world works. The strong do what they can, while the weak suffer what they must. And European civilization took over this continent because it was stronger. It wasn't by winning any arguments. It wasn't by demonstrating, even if you could make a case that European civilization was a better thing to have dominate this continent than the cultures of the Native Americans. I don't know how you're going to compare them, but that is not why we took over. American imperialism, like in Manifest Destiny, when in the middle of the 19th century, the Americans were granting themselves the right to take land away from Native Americans because God wants a more productive economy on the land. I mean, people can rationalize all kinds of things, but anyway, the American imperialism expressed itself again in the Spanish-American War, where we went and seized property from the Spanish, who had been an imperial power and who owned Cuba and the Philippines and Puerto Rico and like that, and then all of a sudden they're part of the American imperial empire. So those are three parts of American imperialism that I could see coming together in the Bush administration. And there was another one that I added at that time too, which still belongs. A religious current, I'm not sure what the right language would be, a kind of religiosity that's part of American civilization, and that is dogmatic, rigid, self-justifying. You can see it in Michener's Hawaii and those missionaries who feel entitled to destroy other people's cultures because they've got the one true faith. You could see it back in the Inquisition in Europe centuries earlier, and you could see it with the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq. You could see people like what's his name, Billy Graham's son Franklin, talking about basically the Crusades. Like going after those godless Muslims, seizing their land because we've got God's truth, not America's best side. But they all congregated together under one tent. And I saw in the way that these currents could flow together and, seamlessly become part of one destructive force, I think that you can infer that there is something called a force of brokenness, of which they are all manifestations. And I say seems, that's why I'm not sure if I actually have 4 ways of showing this thing instead of 3.5. But that's the half if it's a 3.5. A second way is related to it, and I've alluded to it. It's got to do with the consequences of what this actor in the world is doing. Now, when a given actor, whether it's an individual, you or me, or it's a political party, or if it's a nation, if it's a mixture of the good and the bad, like most things are, and not a pure case, which is what I'm about to talk about, of an actor acting consistently in destructive ways, then, okay, you can talk about, I'll get to how you can still see that there's a coherent force, but it's not as visible as when you get a particular actor who, when you look at what they do and what they say, you think, wow, what accounts for the fact that they're so damn consistent in making things worse? I mean, it's today's Republican Party, for example. If you ask, well, is their role on climate change constructive or destructive? That's an easy one. Is their role on helping democratic Ukraine resist the invasion of fascistic Russia constructive or destructive? That's an easy one. Is their role in terms of whether we keep power and wealth more or less well distributed in society versus way polarized between the very, very, very rich and the somewhat poor and the very, very, very powerful and the downtrodden? Well, once again, consistently more broken. Look at the relationships between the races. Is the role of what this thing says and does, this political party, is it to help bring the races together harmoniously so that there's goodwill and comfort and the capacity to work together for the common good? Or is it destructive, to be all the opposite? Well, what do you know? Once again, this actor, it's not taking the right position on anything. Are they taking the right position according to American values with respect to respecting the right of everybody to have a voice at the ballot box? Or are they on the other side? Well, once again, the force of disenfranchisement is the same one. Is this party aligned with the truth or the lie when we are encountering these different versions of the truth, of reality? One that says that Joe Biden won the 2020 election fair and square, and one that says, no, it was stolen from Trump. Once again, the Republican Party, they make dogma out of the big lie. and then they go and align themselves with a guy who's committed the most serious crimes in American history and is making very explicit threats to how he, if elected president again, he would destroy American democracy and create a kind of authoritarian regime. Consistently makes the world worse. What are we to infer from that consistency? Well, that is actually the way I discovered the reality of evil. For other reasons, I like to put the focus on a different way of showing it. But once you've got a force that's flipping the coin and every single one of them is coming up destructive, not constructive, you have to infer that there's something coherent behind it. A coherent force that consistently makes the human world worse. That's what the Republican Party has become. That's not what it was when I was growing up. It wasn't what it was as recently as, I would say, the first Bush presidency. They had plenty of brokenness in it. That no tax cut thing. But, anyway, I won't go there. The party changed into something else. And that something else can be described accurately, because you can see it, a coherent force that's consistently acting to make the human world worse. And that observable reality can be combined with the reasonable statement that phrase, a coherent force, ... makes the human world worse, kind of captures what people in the religious traditions used to talk about in terms of this is how the force of evil operates in the world. I think it turns out that there is something like that operating in the world. And I also take the position that though you don't have to call it evil, there's a good reason to do so. It's important to know what you're up against, and that's the name. That's the name of that book, What We're Up Against, because it helps to clarify the terms on which the battle must be fought, and it also clarifies the structure of the battlefield. I mean, all these things are part of the same picture. They're all part of the same battlefield. Even the way in which the propagandists were able to change the conservative base into something different from what it had been is part of that same battlefield. And it really helps to see things whole. So I've spent 20 years trying to raise the alarm about the reality that American politics had changed. People have, on the liberal side, failing to see this force of evil that's taking over the Republican Party, have continued to talk until fairly recently as if the American political battle is basically politics as usual. My friends across the aisle, not recognizing what has changed. And I think this illustrates the significance of having a conceptual space within the secular worldview for something that to be seen and recognized as a force of evil and fought as such so that you can defeat it. I think we've paid a big price for the fact that the secular worldview really didn't have a space in its conceptual world for a force of evil. I mean, the liberal worldview, a big component of it, didn't even have a place in which value was real. I mean, as opposed to merely subjective and a matter of opinion, let alone being able to see a force of evil. But those dichotomies I was talking about, actually, the reality of value is something that also can be shown. But and I recognize that if I'm trying to persuade people that there's something like a coherent force that consistently makes the human world worse, the word worse implies the reality of value. And I'm willing to, argue that, but that is a different conversation, which I've dealt with in previous videos. But from an evolutionary perspective, you can see that it's not just a matter of opinion. Some things are, but the reality of value. Value is real, important, and life-serving. And I claim to be able to prove that. And so the division between better and worse is a real one that's been actually put into us to experience, because it has proved life-saving for us to have. Anyway, please go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org. And one of the pieces you'll see there has got to do with the pure case, is what we've just been talking about. The Republican Party is, I think, unique in American history, and the party of today, unique in American history. But it's not the only pure case in human history. You can make a pretty good case about the Nazi regime, that it helps to show the reality of evil. I grew up in a time when people were still wrestling with, I was born in 1946, still wrestling with how are we going to understand what happened here. It was a shock to humankind that the world's, what was regarded as, in some ways, the world's most cultured or most civilized people had produced this monstrosity. So there's all kinds of really interesting things written after the World War, the attempt to understand the meaning of what had been seen there in Nazi Germany. This consistently destructive thing that did so many ugly stuff. But I don't think that one of the conclusions that wasn't really brought very well, but a lot of work was done to sort of help you see how that can happen. Like some people studied the family structure of the Nazis and of German pedagogy generally, like Alice Miller's For Your Own Good, and the authoritarian personality was another one. You could see how various forms of brokenness were working together, but nobody quite talked about it that way. From my point of view, one of the interesting things is that I could see how brokenness could take over Germany, because people have been through so many traumas in the previous, the 20 years before Hitler assumes the chancellorship and then seizes all power with an emergency measure that never ends until he's dead. So many traumas, and trauma is fundamentally about brokenness. A person gets broken by trauma. By definition, it's something which is so damaging and injurious in impact that it can't be readily integrated into the whole. That's brokenness. And I could see how various aspects of long-standing German brokenness could be confluent in feeding this coherent force, the Nazi regime that's taking power in this much traumatized nation. Things like anti-Semitism, that had been in Germany since the Middle Ages. Um, there's a book called The Pity of It All, about the history of German-Jewish relations from, well, I think it starts with Moses Mendelssohn coming to Berlin, where Jews are not allowed. Anyway, the drama unfolds in Heinrich Heine and the kind of being assimilated into the culture, and also the anti-Semitism in the culture. That fed into what the Nazis did. Just like we can see that the present Republican Party is a confluence of ugly forces of brokenness that were component, and also German militarism from the Prussian culture. There's a lot that's less than ideal about that kind of martinet discipline. Every culture's got its vulnerabilities, and the Nazis drew together what was broken there and appealed to the worst in people, like the Republican Party consistently does, in order to enlist them as supporters of a force of brokenness. The other case of a pure case that I've studied, and both of these I've studied pretty intensively. When you think about, well, how much has this guy studied anything? If he's talking about all these different things, let me just say, I'm approaching my 78th birthday, and I've been kind of, hardworking and somewhat obsessive about wanting to understand some of these things. So I really did spend some real time looking into the rise of the Civil War. There's a great book about the era leading up to the Civil War called The Impending Crisis. Not the one that was written just before the Civil War, but one by two social scientist historians, one and Stephen Potter, whom I've known from other works before this, but who died with the work not yet finished, and it was completed by another historian whose name I forget. Anyway, it's really a marvelous picture of something very ugly. There was the United States was choking on the issue of slavery. It was being divided over the issue of slavery. And you can look at the brokenness in a couple of ways. One is the country itself is getting polarized on the issue through the 1850s. South starts out really aflame with a somewhat fascistic and bellicose spirit that gathers strength through that decade. The North is kind of fitful in terms of how it's going to deal with that, oftentimes in denial and avoiding conflict. But not only that, I mean, you get a rising response on the anti-slavery, pro-union side, like Uncle Tom's Cabin comes out in, 1852, and the North goes crazy over it. The cruel treatment of the slaves, just ignites something in the breasts of the North. But still, the more aggressive thing comes from the South, which, like the guy in South Carolina who's Butler, I think was his name, goes to the Senate floor and canes almost to death a U.S. senator from Massachusetts, and how that further polarized the country. So there is a whole lot going on. I could continue to talk about bloody Kansas and all kinds of stuff, but the country's getting divided. So that by the time we get to 1860, I mean, we've got two snarling regions looking at each other. But the one who snarled the most significantly was the South, which asserted illegally its right to secede and said, we're gone, we're abrogating our national agreement, and we're willing to fight to make our unilateral decision about our right to secede stick. And so the force of brokenness that was going to be so successful in damaging America, I mean, that's what the force of evil does. It makes the human world more broken. We're still broken because the 1850s took us to that civil war, and we fought that terrible war that inflicted wounds that we've never fully dealt with and generated lies that people around here still believe. That's another issue. But brokenness is brokenness. But there was a reason for that brokenness. Just like the Germans had sort of like a comprehensible historical reason that you could look at what they had been through and you could sort of not justify, but just explain. How do these people get like this? You know, the throngs in Nuremberg that we see in the Triumph of the Will, that Nazi propaganda film made by Lily Wiesenthal, that's Riefenstahl. That's it, I think. Beautiful film. Thousands and thousands of people seek heiling up at their leader, who's become essentially a god to them. How did they get to there? Well, you can understand. Well, whether you understand exactly how they got there or not, you can see that they would get pretty broken going through the history they went through. And similarly with the coming of the Civil War, I'm not going to say that the Civil War was inevitable, though some people do say that. People who know a lot, maybe they know. But there's something very broken also about the South, because the way it got built, the power structure, the wealth structure, was built on a particular platform. You know, as broken as capitalism eventually emerged in the North, the slave system created a culture of great inequalities of wealth and power that were premised on the right of some human beings to treat other human beings as human livestock. And that it is from that system that they get all their wealth and power. It is slavery that makes the people with the great plantations the rulers of a part of the country. And incidentally, if you look at where did the opening president, you know, the first, Lincoln, I think, was the 16th president. So if you look at the first 15 presidents and all the speakers of the House and the chief justices of the Supreme Court up until Lincoln, way more power in the hands of the slaveholders. They weren't not only were they used to dominating their other human beings and manipulating the other people they didn't own, but they were also used to running the show. Some of them were very good rulers. I mean, I'm not going to say that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson don't belong on Mount Rushmore, but they were slaveholders. Jefferson was very eloquent in something he wrote about how morally corrupting it was to be a slaveholder. Not that he would give up his slaves. So brokenness is at the center of the thing, of that slave power. There's a tyranny of a few over the many. There's the tyranny of the slave, of the owner over the property, the human property. And there's a nation that they've been dominating, which is evolving in the direction of shifting the power toward the north, partly because of those Irish immigrants I talked about before, and the industrialization of the north. The slave power wasn't going to remain as dominant, and they lost the 1860 election. And these people who were accustomed to having their power rule their world couldn't accept that they'd lost an election to somebody who wanted to not to take their slaves away. Lincoln never said, he said he had no constitutional authority to affect slavery where it was. But they were going to be frustrated if Lincoln had his way at expanding their empire into the rest of the country. I mean, the Dred Scott decision had implications like there would no longer be a line that divided the slave states and the free states, like the Missouri Compromise. The South was the one that was aggressively going after. We got to have our way, period. Pretty broken. And they were willing to go to war rather than to subordinate themselves. For one thing, just for 4 years to a president who happened to get elected on something of a fluke because the Democratic Party that could have elected somebody divided itself between two pretty pro-slavery people. But Stephen Douglas of Illinois, that Lincoln had gone up against, who was pretty pro-slavery in all those debates, he wasn't pro-slavery enough for the extremists that had taken over the South. So there's the brokenness of the urge to dominate, the refusal to subordinate. But surrounding it is that the country really had a big issue that was not going to be easy to deal with. I don't know what the alternative American history might have looked like if whatever was different. More sanity, less greed. But how do you get those things? I don't know what it would have looked like. But it was already in the Constitution that we were going to have a problem. The deal that the non-slave states made, giving the slave states 3/5 of a person for every slave. I don't know if they thought that through. I really would like to know, because it was a disaster. That's why a big part of why the South was able to control the country so much, giving us most of our presidents, most of our Supreme Court justices, most of our speakers of the House, et cetera, like that. Because who gets the states that have these big slave plantations get to inflate the number that on the basis of which their representation is determined, which also influences how many votes they get in the Electoral College, I think. Isn't it the representatives plus senators? So if you get more representatives because you're letting slaveholders be fortified in the population count, in the census, by how many human beings they're able to treat as their property, you're giving a lot of power to that region. We were dealing with this issue 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, 1850 with the Compromise of 1850, and then continuing to try to paper over this intensifying battle. Bloody Kansas in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, setting up all kinds of terrible things, and including what happened in Kansas of a massacre, and then the avenging John Brown goes and kills people too, and he eventually goes to Harper's Ferry, and that is a part of the spark that leads to a war that we haven't recovered from still. But you can empathize with the country. We had struggled so hard for it for again and again and again. We blew it, and it's hard for me to accept that we couldn't have done better. I don't know what that would have taken. But in any event, the explanation of why is it that a pure case of a destructive force could emerge at that time, that's part of what fed it. That the country was, in fact, divided over a really, really big issue. The most powerful and wealthy interests in the country felt that their interests and power was being threatened. And the efforts to resolve the conflict kept on coming up short, largely because there was no spirit of compromise on that side. But that's according to me. That's how I see it. I really do not like the Confederacy. I was brought up on 1950s movies in which, brother against brother and real respect for both the Confederacy and the Union. I don't feel that way anymore. I mean, I can see things about it that showed some of the nobility and decency that was in that culture. I mean, a Robert E. Lee is not just a human monster. I mean, he's not like Donald Trump. But by a set of loyalties and the fact that he was himself a slave owner by marrying into the Custis family and owning that wonderful property that's just across the river, and it's now the Arlington Cemetery. Even that marvelous Southern gentleman was willing to fight for something which was basically intended to preserve the system of slavery. Just like Jefferson abhorred the effects of slavery, Robert E. Lee sort of indicated in something he wrote or said that slavery would eventually have to disappear. But all the power was aligned in the South with the way the South got built. And it fed a certain kind of ugly spirit of dominance and cruelty even. The treatment of slaves was not nearly so benign as the heritage not hate gang, Even before Trump and even before this Republican Party, the generations of the South have been taught to believe the lie. Anyway, both the pure actor of the South and the pure actor of the coming of the Nazi regime are sort of explicable in terms of that history had dealt some cards that were sure to make the human world, give the human world a whole lot of brokenness to work with, to feed a destructive force. But the Republican Party's becoming this, I see differently. I've been watching this thing emerge since I first heard Rush Limbaugh on the radio. I was driving on my way to, that's my wife back there. It was her 20th high school reunion, which is down in Jacksonville, Florida. I don't have a lot of experience. This is before we lived in below the Mason-Dixon line. We lived in Maryland. And we went down to Jacksonville, where a lot of her Confederate classmates who had, with her, attended Nathan Bedford Forrest High School would be celebrating their 20th high school reunion. My wife had gone with me to my high school reunion, a couple of them, I think, already at that point. Yeah, a couple of them. And my high school's in Union Country for sure, in suburban St. Paul, Minnesota. So I went with her, and so did our young son, who at that time was 2, and the 2 children from my first marriage, and we had adventures doing that. Some of them very positive, like the beauty of Savannah, Georgia. But in South Carolina, I heard Rush Limbaugh on the radio. I thought that this guy must be some local guy, that South Carolina with its extreme politics. You know, they gave us Strom Thurmond, the Dixiecrat presidential candidate, 1948, and they're the ones that led the way. So the first to secede and the first to fire on the Union troops at Fort Sumter. I thought, oh, this kind of, oh my God, look at this, listen to this. It's so fascistic. But you know, I soon learned that he was already a big deal across the nation. I hadn't gotten the news, and then not long after that came the news that a station that I had really liked, WMAL, respected, like a basic decent American radio station, in the Twin Cities where I spent a lot of growing up. There was a station called WCCO. But it was like that, really a community station, basically goodwill, serving the community in a whole variety of ways. I was shocked to find out that the guy that I'd heard in South Carolina on the radio was going to be on for 3 hours on WMAL. Not at all like WCCO in the Twin Cities back in the 60s when I was going to high school, and, you know, and feeling like, you know, I could tune into that station and feel sort of at home with that basic American decency that I grew up appreciating. It's been gathering. And Newt Gingrich took me in for a little while, but eventually I started seeing that he was what I later learned that he in fact was. He was a pretty bright man who was utilizing the tools of the Nazi regime for propaganda. Goebbels had written, you know, sort of a manual for people like Limbaugh and Gingrich. Gingrich would use the word abnormal in relation to the word liberal, so as to implant beyond the reasoning capacity, I guess, some way of thinking. Anyway, to make a long story short, you add to Limbaugh and Gingrich, you add Fox News, which really transformed people. People will talk about their parents. I mean, you've probably read about it. People whose parents were such and such a way, and then for some reason, you know, all that was available to them was Fox News, or they just started watching Fox News, and they got to be very different people. So I don't think that what's happened in the rise of this power taking over conservative America, I don't think that's either like the Nazis, because we haven't been through any kind of sufficient national trauma like the Germans did. And we haven't had any major political unresolvable issue, something huge like slavery was, that divided the nation and breaking it up. Instead, what I think has happened this time around is that a propagandistic force that I believe was formed by a plutocratic force. Sorry, I can't come up with a better word at the moment. But things like the Koch brothers and the ALEC that they helped to found, and maybe the Chamber of Commerce and the NRA and all kinds of things like that, sort of joining forces to sell the American people a whole bunch of lies that would divide the American people and create a base that was ready to support a fascistic power, not through trauma, not out of the fracturing of the country of an unresolvable issue like slavery, but simply because you had a lot of money that's well organized, that's backed by a lot of malevolent intelligence, that's happy to take as much power and wealth as they can get, insatiable in those respects, that exercise its considerable inventive intelligence to generate a propagandistic campaign from Limbaugh to Fox News to Karl Rove. And Donald Trump is different because he, I think, hijacked the whole thing. That created the Republican base that we've got today. Or, to be more exact, that created the Republican base that Trump now utilizes and helped to shape. First, Trump was a symptom of what was already there. The propagandists had already created by 2015. We can tell. I mean, it's obvious. It's a fact. The base was such that a guy like Donald Trump could be elected, could get the Republican nomination. Brokenness begets brokenness. And the Republican Party now consists of multiple layers, each of which is possessed by a force of brokenness. There's the base, as it's been created, that will support somebody like Trump, believe obvious lies. There's the Republicans in Congress who will stand by while the worst among them call the shots so that we don't arm. We basically, they're allowed to turn the United States policy into something that protects Putin, rather than letting the funds flow so that we can make Putin a failure, which is clearly our national interest. And then there's Donald Trump. And you can't say too much about how broken he is. At really, pretty much every level. Brokenness begets brokenness. And that's one way you can see the pure case, that all the consequences of what it says and what it does is always to make the human world worse. But since I actually, in the mission that I'm on, want to convey a still bigger picture, the evolutionary perspective that shows that there's a better and a worse, and that shows that when we stepped across the threshold onto the path of civilization, a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse inevitably emerged, so that I can claim that I can prove that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large, but is a consequence of something that is a systemic force. This kind of thing that we see the Republican Party as, and we can see fascism on the global level as in these last 20 years as democracy's been losing ground, that we can actually see something bigger than any of those things. That's an important part of the drama that's been acted out in the human world over the millennia even. So to show, in a sense, what that thing is about the problem of power and social evolution, which is to say the implications of our species taking the unprecedented step onto the path of civilization. For the first time in 3.5 billion years of life's evolving, you've got a creature that's inventing its own way of life. That creates a whole new situation, and in that situation is inevitably generated a systemic force that will reverberate in destructive ways as the history of that civilization creating creature unfolds itself, and human civilization in the case of this. I say that any creature that takes that step anywhere, not confining ourselves to Earth, will inevitably unleash such a force. So since I want to show the way the battle against evil, or against a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse, is an inevitable feature of the human drama, I like to show the reality of evil in this way. That we should look at the causes and effects. I mean, we're talking about a secular worldview here, which has got to do with utilizing our reason to make sense of what we know empirically to be true. And making sense of this, see that the step onto civilization is a step into disorder, because up until that point, evolution's continually creating a natural order in which the interactions of all the components have been selected to be compatible with the synergy and viability of the whole. But the interactions of civilizing societies, are not governed by any order. This is a new kind of life form that has not been the creature of, since the one-celled creatures. And of course, even reaching one cell of the kind that we're made of, I think took 2.5 billion years, just one cell. It's a long process, and it continually creates orders in which the various things, I say the lion and the zebra and the grass, work together to create a perpetual motion machine, even as they devour each other. But there's a systemic force that emerges when you step outside that order, and you have these unprecedented life forms, civilized societies, interacting with each other in some way that has no order regulating it at all. No natural order, no human imposed order. It's an anarchy. And then I'm going to go quickly over this, but go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org. I can show that if you're going to have that kind of anarchy, if you're going to have a war of all against all, which is the inevitable consequence of anarchy, the war of all against all is going to generate a selective process for the cultural options. And there is a whole wide spectrum of cultural options once you break out of the ecological niche in which you evolved in. Of all the cultural options that a civilization creating species might extend into the future, only those that can prevail in a war of all against all will survive and spread. You might have a lot of beautiful things, but if you don't do well in a world that's anarchic, and we can see from some examples that we've seen even in our times, when you've got anarchy, it's warlords or gangsters that rise to the top. That's what civilization inevitably entails. That is the inevitable consequence of a creature extricating itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically by inventing its own way of life. The war of all against all transmits a pattern of brokenness that you can sort of see. Like, what are the consequences of this kind of brokenness, this disorder? Well, you can see a lot of brokenness happens. People get traumatized by war. The systems of society that get formed by the conquest of the gangster are very broken. The societies that get shaped by the selection for the ways that are conducive to success in the ways of in such a anarchic situation, the consistent with prevailing in the war against all, that the selection for those things means that the demands of power will have way too much influence in deciding how the human world will be. And so people are going to be compelled by their societies that are evolving in the direction in which the spirit of the gangster has way too much say in how human civilization survives, tyranny and slavery, etc. They're going to be compelled to incorporate within themselves the demands of those societies. And those societies, in turn, have been shaped too much by the demands of power and too little by what fulfills human needs. So we got brokenness pretty much wherever we look as just, I'm not claiming that I've shown the inevitability of that here now. I don't want to get into that in more detail than I just did. But if you go to betterhumanstory.org, I do this in a couple thousand words. I think you won't find any holes in the argument. But just based on that initial thing, that the step onto the path of civilization inevitably unleashes this destructive force. And if you look at the consequences, you can see how brokenness begets brokenness. In the first place, you got the brokenness of people being injured by this terrible situation, cities being put to the sword, and all the rest of the stuff we see. And you get people being broken by having to incorporate, internalize, as the psychoanalysts would put it, the demands of morality that's not really all that friendly to human nature, because human nature isn't calling the shots, or at least it's not calling the shots all that much. I say that the way to envision, my favorite way in terms of being able to really get from this point about a force of evil or a destructive force being real to the big picture that I'm really eager to convey to the world, which is why I'm doing these videos. The best way to do it is to look at the dense network of causes and effects. This is not a religious perspective. This is a dynamics of the system thing. You look at the connections between causes and effects, and you find something broken in the human world. A war, hatred, greed, injustice, whatever you want to make the list. And there's plenty of different ways of talking about it. And you ask, okay, what are the causes of this? If we were to look at how it is that this thing that we've isolated, this war, or this injustice, or whatever it is, came to be rather than something better, I think you would find, and I don't claim that I've actually proved this like in detail, but I've been looking at this kind of stuff in some way or other for 54 years. If you look at it, you'll see that the things that led to the broken outcome were broken things, brokenness in different forms. Just like white supremacy and corporate greed were brokenness in different forms that could readily be seen as, this different manifestations of the same thing. If we would look at how cause and effect have gone in producing the brokenness that we see in the world, like how did Russia get to be a society in which somebody like Putin could have the kind of power he has? You see that there were brokenness in all the various causes. And then in the other direction, that looks to the past about how did this come to be? And then you ask, well, what are the effects on this? How did the human future become different because of this brokenness or this wholeness? Both of them can be seen operating, but I'm just going to focus on wholeness because I'm focusing on, brokenness because I'm focusing on evil. What are the repercussions of this thing happening? Brokenness in the Republican base enabled somebody like Donald Trump to become the Republican nominee. Exactly the kind of broken person you do not want to have entrusted with the powers of the presidency. And then you say, well, what happened? What were the consequences of Trump being the Republican nominee and then Trump becoming president? It's like the Civil War. I mean, it's sort of hard to even wrap your mind around what all the broken consequences have been of this. But what I maintain is, if you look at the way that history has unfolded, human history, and all the ways in which what's good in the human world and what's not good in this, destructive, injurious, damaging in the human world, have come to pass, you will find out that there's something that's, in a sense, not to personify, but that patterns of brokenness are getting transmitted from one form to another. And the idea of a pattern of brokenness is key here. What are the consequences of the Koch brothers' greed? I mean, here are guys that got billions of dollars, and they're willing to go to war against American democracy. I'm not saying that's what they're doing now, bankrolling Nikki Haley, but I know what they were doing. I've run against them. This is an ugly, ugly, ugly thing. Brokenness begets brokenness. The forces that have worked to bring us to this point where American democracy is almost, well, is endangered, where it is possible that the leader of the free world might become an ally with the guy who's been the most florid and aggressive enemy of the free world, Vladimir Putin, for 20 years. You can really see how brokenness creates brokenness. It goes it moves brokenness through shape-shifting forms. As cause becomes effect, and effect then becomes a cause of things in the future, and the pattern of brokenness gets moved through the human world. And this is a line that I think is very useful for envisioning how it can be meaningful to talk about a force, a coherent force. I say that you can see this force when you trace these causes and effects and the spreading of the pattern of the brokenness. The way we see the wind in the swaying of the trees and the flapping of the clothes on the line. You don't see the wind, but you know that it's there moving these things. And that's what a force is. In physics, one of the early formulae that you learn is F equals ma. The force is equal to mass times acceleration. In Galileo's experiments with balls rolling on inclined planes and such like that, the force is the force of gravity. You don't see the force of gravity, but you can infer it from the fact that it moves the ball. A force is something that moves something. And we can see that the force of brokenness that arose inevitably with civilization is moving this pattern of brokenness through the human world, through the processes of cause and effect. There's no demonization. There's nothing supernatural. There's no devil at work in this, I would want to call it evil, but this force of destruction, this force of brokenness. It's happening, in a perfectly in a way that can be seen when we employ the secular worldview to fill in some blanks that have been left unfilled in by what we've done so far. I'm a big fan of Darwin's. My idea that's in that book really is quite indebted to Darwin because I create a theory of social evolution, or the evolution of civilization, which owes a lot to this elegant structure that Darwin created, where he's got diversity, he's got only some survive, he's got non-randomness about which survive and which do not, and then he gets that non-randomness is natural selection, which shapes the species. I utilize that structure. I've sometimes wondered if I had never studied Darwin and evolutionary theory and understood, the huge opening he gave our understanding by making a secular understanding of how it is that something like us might come into existence, and how our history emerged from all that. I feel quite indebted. I kind of wonder whether I ever would have seen what I think I can demonstrate to be true. But it's not surprising that, well, I don't know if it's surprising or not. Sometimes I am surprised. Our secular worldview has not really kept up with, or it hasn't pursued the implications of the Darwinian perspective, of the evolutionary's perspective. One of the implications is that when our creature started inventing its own way of life, that ain't just more life on Earth. That is a big point of discontinuity. And the secular worldview hasn't taken that into account. Very different things start to happen, and that is the nature of the challenge that we face as a species. When we have a toss-up whether we're going to destroy ourselves or not, what's going to determine whether human civilization survives or not is how well we're able to deal with the force of the destructive force that we inevitably unleash. And if we don't even look at that force, if we just sort of fight the immediate fight, like, it's important to fight for the defeat of Donald Trump in 2024, and to fight against the defeat of the Republican Party and this monstrosity that it's become in 2024, and to fight for to completely to make Vladimir Putin the kind of Russian leader that gets overthrown because he's blown it in a war. That's a historical pattern they have. Oh, I'd love to see that. I mean, I don't know what would replace him, I will admit. It wouldn't be Navalny, obviously. It would help us to fight that fight better if we understood what we're up against, the nature of the forces that are contending, what it would look like for us to bring those forces under control. One of the things, I mean, I don't pretend to know, I don't have a roadmap of how we get to the destination we need to get to. But I have some suggestions. Part of it has got to do with, it is important to understand that being a civilization creating species inevitably entails the emergence of two coherent forces that look a lot like good and evil, embattled to determine whether the species ultimately is whether it's going to destroy itself or get its act together. But on the way, for the thousands of years that we see, we've got those two forces battling, and it hasn't been a real particularly encouraging history. But I say that the ugliness that we see in human history is not human nature writ large, and I claim to be able to prove it. And I think it would be helpful for us not only to understand the nature of the forces that we're up against, but to have a better understanding of what we are by nature. We are better creatures, I think I can prove, than we have believed ourselves to be. And we've been taught to believe ourselves to be, because we've grown up in cultures that have actually not had all that benign a relationship to human nature, because they've been dictated by the demands of power that require us to internalize things that make us more useful to power, but more injured in our own lives. I think it really is valuable to understand that what's happened to our species would happen to any creature with the creative intelligence that we uniquely have on this planet to develop a whole life strategy based on culture, and then to take that cultural trip and take that unprecedented step of discontinuity about creating a new life form that's not been shaped by natural selection. We are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. And we are up against something that we unleashed. We didn't unleash it because we're evil, but there is evil. I mean, if you accept my definition that evil is a coherent force that consistently works to spread a pattern of brokenness, or however you want to put it, if you could accept that definition of evil, which I have found to be the best that I can come up with, there is evil. If you don't like that phrase, okay. Trump is Trump and the Trump Party and the rise of fascism generally is a manifestation of an age-old battle. We got to fight the local battle, but it also helps to understand we're up against a challenge that the step onto the path of civilization implied we'd eventually get to. Take a look on betterhumanstory.org. Look for the fate of human civilization. It was inevitable that we would eventually face the question, can we order ourselves well enough, soon enough, so that we can survive for the long haul on this planet rather than destroy ourselves? And I suggest that in addition to understanding the nature of that battle, one important step is to ask ourselves, what would the world have to look like for the danger of that we would destroy ourselves to be non-existent, or if that's asking for too much, as minimal as it can be, to envision a world in which there could be no nuclear holocaust, to envision a human civilization that's on this planet and is living in harmony with the rest of life on Earth. We need to envision that. I'm not saying it's easy, but that has got to be our goal. I think we may well not reach that goal. Keeping that destination in mind is one important step in maximizing our chance of reaching it. And then the second thing that I feel like I can say, and this also is not real specific, like the roadmap I don't claim to have, but we're in this situation here, and we got to get to this situation that we envision, and we'll disagree about how to envision it, but that's part of the job we got to do, is to have that conversation and revise as we need to revise, but in any event, given the best that we can come up with as envisioning that destination. What are the steps we could take now, wisely, that would be best efforts to take us in the direction of getting to that destination in time? Those are questions that don't answer themselves, but there are also questions that, as we look around the world, there's not a lot of attention paid to them. I claim that it's pretty much of a toss-up whether we will destroy ourselves or get our act together. Which is to say, there's a battle going on between two forces that are reasonable to call good and evil. And it's a toss-up which one of them is going to win. I think we need to do everything that's in our power, if it's a toss-up, to tackle the job long term. Yeah, short-term tackle, beat Trump, drive this Trump party into oblivion. Those would be good. They're part of the job. That's part of ordering our civilization whole enough. I mean, everything that Trump does makes things worse. I mean, if the Iranians are weeks away from a nuclear bomb because he withdrew from a treaty that would have kept them at least a year away, that's increasing the danger of self-destruction. The immediate battle is not apart from the long-term battle, but it should be conceived in those terms. We also need to figure out what is it about, why is it that democracy has lost ground in the last 18 years, according to whatever that outfit is that monitors these things. Why did that happen? What is it that wasn't working right in the world of democracies that enabled the force of fascism to make gains, not just in the United States, but in Turkey and India and Israel too? There's a lot of difficult questions to work on, but human beings are really intelligent. We need to do a couple things. On the liberal side, we need to use more intelligence to see the whole picture. And on the conservative side here in America, we need to deal with what has disabled their intelligence, because they're just as intelligent as, well, there's plenty of intelligence on the conservative side of America. How do we get them back to sanity and a real contact with reality? Those are all parts of the big job of how do we make human civilization viable for the long term. I hope you'll go to abetterhumanstory.org. If you're interested in seeing the reality of evil and the life-serving nature of the moral dimension, etc., go to betterhumanstory.org. I present things piece by piece systematically there. Here I give myself a license to try to multidimensional, if I can verbify that, the whole picture and suggest that there's something here that will clarify the challenge we face. For those people who join me in really caring about the survival of American democracy and for this long-term survival of human civilization and life on Earth, I hope you'll go to betterhumanstory.org. And I hope that you'll subscribe to my podcast where I give it everything I got. I'm an old man in the fourth quarter, man on a mission, I say, because I do think that there are some things that are shown here that will increase our odds of success in facing this challenge that was implied when our species, because of our exceptional creative intelligence, not because of anything evil about us, we're eventually going to have to face about whether life or death is going to be the consequence of life experimenting with this kind of a species that can change the rules and unleash forces it didn't envision and must bring under control. Thank you. I'll be back on Thursday at 11 in the morning Eastern, and I might be back between now and then if I feel so moved. And as always, I hope that you will, if any of these things would matter to you, if you saw that they were true, I hope you'll check out to see if they get demonstrated as compellingly as I claim. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.